This man right here is my great-grandfather. He's the first cat herder in our family.
Herding cats. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy.
Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs, well, that's another thing altogether.
Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here, and if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, you know?
You see the movies, you hear the stories, I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't a feeling like it in the world.
So we find ourselves with Moses. And Moses is leading these people through the wilderness. And I imagine leading all these people. We don't know the exact numbers, but we think somewhere between 50,000 to 3 million. So, pretty big window, but a lot of people. It's probably somewhat like leading cats through the wilderness, right? Herding cats. Or much like having a road trip with 3 million children in your back seat. Constantly complaining and constantly asking that age-old question, are we there yet? Road trips. We always, road trips are much like camping, for me anyway. We always forget how much work camping is and how much uncomfortable it is to sleep on the ground. But yeah, we forget, so we go back again. For me, that's like road trips. I forget how much a screaming kid in the back seat for 1 hour, how much that really drives you insane. You get this vision of traveling through the United States and seeing these beautiful things, but it's really never like that. It's more like, she's in my space, or he kicked me, or she bit me, or whatever, right? Road trips are not a whole lot of fun. I don't imagine it was a whole lot of fun. And we learned that it wasn't a whole lot of fun for Moses. And road trips are even less fun when you see a sign that says detour, right? We all know this sign. If you live in Minnesota, we're intimately familiar with detour signs, as we seem to have more construction here than I think any other state I've ever been to. We repair our roads just so we can trash them with our snowplows, right? So we have a lot of detour signs. And there's nothing worse than seeing a detour sign, right? You're driving, you have this plan, this itinerary, and you see this detour sign, and you know that all that plan is out the window. Because you don't know how long that detour is going to be. Especially on the interstate, they could take you off down to these country roads where you hit gravel, and you're like, am I going the right way? And 2 hours later, you're back on the road again. Detours. Well, today we're going to talk about the lower story, and perhaps the longest detour ever known, 40 years. 40 years of wandering through the desert, through the wilderness. Moses leads these people to the promised land, flowing with milk and honey. And during this, in order to get to this promised land, there's this mass migration of people. And just like any road trip, people start to complain. We see this in Numbers 11 through 12. And there's essentially 3 complaints to Moses. There's just the general hardships of this travel with so many people. And they start complaining also about food, right? They start complaining about food, and they're not getting enough. And even in Egypt, we got to eat. And so God provides and gives them this thing called manna, which is somewhat like bread, that they go and collect these seeds and they make this bread out of it. In a past church, we preached on the wandering of the Israelites in the wilderness, and as an experiment to lead up to this sermon, the pastor asked the staff, and I was a youth pastor at that time, to do a 2-week fast of pancakes. And so I was like, well, I like pancakes. It sounds like easy enough. But of course, you couldn't have any syrup or any blueberries blueberries or bananas or chocolate chips, just pancakes. And so I ate pancakes for 2 weeks, which, by the way, is not the greatest for diets, because it's like tons of carbohydrates. But I ate pancakes for 2 weeks, and I remember even I had a drill between the National Guard between the 2 weeks, and I was doing land navigation, so I was literally wandering in the wilderness, and I had a pocket full of pancakes, and I would just eat this pancakes while I'm wandering in the wilderness. And through that experiment, we realized that even though we know that God provides for us, that God is giving us this blessings each day, we tend to take that for granted. The Israelites did the same exact thing. So they complained about the hardship of the trip, there wasn't enough food, and then Miriam and Aaron complained about Moses being the driver, the leader, which is pretty common, I think, on some road trips. Even the adults, even the parents, tend to fight, about directions and who should drive and who shouldn't drive and how good of a driver someone might be. So they complain. And then they come to this crossroads. They finally get to this edge of greatness. Right? They get to the point where they're up to the promised land. They're kind of a crossroads. We've all been here before, right? A crossroads in our life. We come to a point where we have to make a decision that will affect essentially the rest of our lives. Maybe this was a big crossroads for you right out of high school. You decide, do I enter the workforce? Do I go to college? Or maybe right out of college. You had this great exodus, so to speak, where you're kind of in college, not really living life, but you finally get to this point, this crossroads, where you have to figure out what you're going to do next. Maybe it's taking a job that requires you to move from this home that you've known for so many years. Maybe it's building a house, or starting a business, or starting to date a girl or a guy. We all get to a point where we get to this crossroads in our lives. I believe that St. Francis of Methodist Church is at this point. That we are at the edge of greatness. I believe that God desires every church to enter into greatness. And you might be thinking, well, Pastor K, that can't be right. You said that we should be a mega church? No, I don't think so. That's probably not right for us. But I think we need to look at what the meaning of greatness is. Greatness is not determined by attendance, offering, but the size of our church. Greatness is reflected by being all that we can be in the place that God has placed us. Greatness is being all that we can be in the place that God has placed us. I believe that every church at some point comes to a crossroads, which decides whether or not to enter into greatness. Whether or not a church enters into greatness is decided in that very significant location, a place called the edge of greatness. And this place is where opportunity and choice intersect. This morning I want to share with you the story of how an Old Testament people stood at the edge of greatness. There's no doubt that God had brought them to this moment. We have learned in past weeks about how God had sent Moses to deliver God's people out of Egypt. God had a desire to build a nation, to bless all other nations, and this was that nation, and God had provided. There were slaves in Egypt, and God delivered them. He brought them across the wilderness, and now they were standing upon the edge of greatness for this promised new land. Yet when they get there, they're kind of hit with a crisis of belief. With the overwhelming evidence of God providing for them behind them, they suddenly stop believing God and stop moving forward. They stop believing God and stop moving forward. They send out 12 spies. A man from each tribe. A few weeks ago we talked about Joseph, and Joseph's father Jacob had 12 sons, and the 12 sons became the tribes of Israel. And so there's a person sent out from each tribe to go survey the promised land. In a few moments, we will note that out of the 12 spies who investigated this greatness of their tomorrow, 10 said that it could not be done. Our church stands at the same edge of greatness. For today, we must decide whether to press on into greatness or retreat into the wilderness of mediocrity. I want to share with you 3 characteristics, I think, of moving on into greatness. First, greatness begins with a vision. A vision of opportunity. Chapter 13, verse 2 says, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel." What is vision? Well, Charles Swindoll says, vision is this: the ability to see God's presence, to perceive God's power, to focus on God's plan in spite of the obstacles. I'll read that again for you. The ability to see God's presence, to perceive God's power, and to focus on God's plan in spite of the obstacles. That is vision. As God has commanded those, as God commanded, they chose representatives from each tribe. They sent them out, these leaders, to survey this land that God has promised. And it's still a function of us here in leadership today in our church, to explore the vision of tomorrow. Bring back the word for direction today. We do this in our church. We've done this in our church. We did this, I think, 3 or 4 weekends ago. We invited leaders of our church, of our chairs of our committees, and also people who want to be leaders in our church, to go down to St. Paul for a day of leadership development, for visioning the future. We had a great time. Very, very, very energized, very excited leaders in this church. And we inspired them to create goals and visions, and not just maintaining the status quo, but to go further, to dream, to have visions of what the church that we should be, the church that should be based on our mission statement, to bring Christ to others. Visions to grow our church, visions to serve our community, visions to make disciples, visions to empower future leaders. And that's what we did. That's what the Israelites did. There's a story of six shoe company executives who were sent out to scout out prospects for an expansion of a new country that was just coming out of this primitive state. They looked around and conferred and disagreed about the potential market for shoes in this country. 4 emailed their majority report back that says, "No market here, everyone goes barefoot." The minority of 2 advised, "Everyone here needs shoes. Recommend opening a branch factory and office immediately." All the executives noted the same thing, that everyone here was barefoot. That's how they interpreted the situation and applied to themselves that county. 10 spies went out and reported about the abundance of the land, and also about giants who lived there, and conclude, "We cannot take this land." And 2 spies report the same thing, but concluded that because God is with us, we can take this land. We can move on to greatness. We can capture our future. In our church, we've had many years to consider what God can do. You've seen it. I've looked back at your history, and you have seen what God can do at this church and in this community. We have seen His past faithfulness, and we should believe that His future provision for us. But will we believe enough to cross over into greatness? Greatness begins with a vision of the opportunities. Secondly, greatness is ultimately determined by the decision to cross over. I don't want you to fail and notice the last part of chapter 13, verse 2 that I just read. spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. God states in the present tense, I am giving you this land, this promised land, this land flowing with milk and honey. It is yours. I've already given it to you. But will they cross over to possess that promise? Will they cross over to possess that greatness? God has called us into greatness. But we have to make the decision to cross over. Everyone wants. Everyone sees what they need change in their life, and they want to change, and they want to do better. But it's that crossing over. That requires work. It requires risk. We don't want to do that. Everyone who looked at the opportunities before them could see the evidence that this was a great land. They could see the greatness in their future. All 12 Hebrew spies said the exact same thing. The spies said, and they were told him and said, we went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. The report was good. It was undeniable but of all the blessings that they had ahead of them. They have to cross over, and they have to take it. For many of them, the threat overweighed the blessings. Nonetheless, the people, in verse 28, said, nonetheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. 10 of the spies sent out came back with a bad report about the situation. In a nutshell, it can't be done. Have you ever heard that before? It can't be done. When the original negativism was not enough, they began to imagine that things were worse than they actually were. Verse 32 says, and they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land. Those who cannot trust in God to overcome the challenge will generally exaggerate and challenge the challenge to make their refusal more plausible. In essence, the report said we should hesitate, we should resist, we should wait, we should go back. Unbelief always waits for a convenient season, but many times there never is a convenient season. They were positive as long as they weren't confronted with the decision to advance, to change, or to want to do something different. And there were always risks. There were always giants ahead of us. There's conflict among us, the giants of future unknown, the giants of shadows of the undetected that we cannot see. For others, the blessing outweighed the threat. Caleb said, we are well able to overcome it. He repeatedly says, he will lead us. He will give it to us. He will, do not be afraid. The Lord is with us. Joshua and Caleb also saw the giants. They saw God as larger than the giants. They knew that the God who led them that far would not abandon them on this edge of greatness. Thirdly, there are results when we refuse to cross over to greatness. There's something that happens if we decide to not advance, to not change, to not adapt. When a church refuses greatness, often it returns on itself. Numbers 14 contains a full report of the self-destructive grumbling that characterized God's people who refused greatness. A church either gives itself to growth and visions, or pettiness and arguments about procedures, policies, and preservation of the status quo happen. When a church refuses greatness, it wants to go back. When our memories become stronger than our visions, then that's a problem. And there's no room for growth there. There's no room for excitement. There's no room for vision. It is my fear that some of us are living in the past, that our memories are bigger than our visions. And we are called to have visions. We are called to imagine the greatness that God has for us, to serve this community that we live in, to serve St. Francis. On the edge of bigness, a church may decide to turn around and go back. Israel wanted to suddenly go back to Egypt, the good old days of slavery and Brick Lane. But they were caught in the wilderness of wandering for 40 years of lost opportunities. A church does not go back to the way it was. When a church says no to greatness, there are years of slow death and decline. We have leaders of a church have gone to these Methodist workshops, and they tell us time and time again that if we don't move forward, if we don't advance, if we don't try to build a community or to have a healthy church or to grow, then we're led to a slow death and decline. We see that. We see churches that we know, the towns that we grew up in, are closing their doors because they're not willing to advance into greatness. What will your response be? Will you choose to go forward for the Lord or remain the same? We are at the edge of greatness. At the intersection of opportunity and choice. Will we go forward this year and seize the opportunities that God has for us? Will we seek opportunities to serve our community? Will you step up and become a leader or a mentor or a teacher? Will we create as a church programming to attract and to serve the needs of young families? Will we make disciples? Will you invite your friends, your family, your coworkers, your neighbors to church to experience the same loving congregation, the same loving family that you experience every single Sunday? After Moses urges the people to trust God and take the land, the people rebel and refuse to obey. This wrong turn, this detour, takes place at Kadesh Barnea, which is located at the edge of this promised land of Canaan. And Israel's lack of trust and disobedience of God creates a 40-year detour for the Israelites. And 40 years later, they end up in the same spot where they had left. Here Moses gives his grand speech. You find this in Deuteronomy 32:33. He says in his grand speech, he says, choose life. And that we're not alone. For God is with them. This morning, I tell you the truth, that we are on the edge of greatness. We are a church that can do so much more and be so much more. But we have to choose life. We have to choose to advance. And most importantly, we have to remember that God is with us. Amen.